Texas Panhandle, June 1873. The dust storm had blown out just before sunrise, leaving the land stretched wide and quiet under a bruised sky when Grady Gallows spotted the wrecked stagecoach slumped on its side near the dry creek bed. His horse, Flint, snorted. Uneasy with the scent of blood in the air, Grady dismounted, rifle drawn. The coach was torn open like a gutted animal. Two dead men lay face down in the dirt, one with a bullet in his back, the other slumped halfway out the door. Then he heard it. A soft, broken sob. Not far off, he moved fast, boots crunching gravel, heart thudding. Behind a patch of sagebrush, wrapped in a torn satin wedding dress, sat a woman. Her veil hung crooked, her cheek bruised, and her eyes brown like dark river mud locked onto his. She did not flinch. "You hurt?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. She blinked hard, then shook her head and looked down at her hands. Blood crusted one palm. Grady crouched in front of her. "My name's Grady Gallows." "I ain't gonna hurt you. I thought they'd come back," she whispered. "They won't, not anymore." He glanced back at the coach. "You the only one left," she nodded once. "They killed the driver and the man I was supposed to marry." Grady studied her. She looked maybe 20 or so, young but not soft, not anymore. The wind had dragged grit through her curls. Her lip was split. "Name?" he asked. She lifted her chin. "Beulah Vance." "All right, Miss Vance, let's get you out of here." He offered his hand. She stared at it for a beat, then took it. Her fingers trembled, but her grip was strong. Beulah climbed up behind him on Flint, her arms hesitating before circling his waist. Grady clicked his tongue, and they rode east toward his ranch in silence, the prairie wide and golden around them. Grady lived alone a few miles outside of Canyon, in a house he built with his own hands after the war. He had no wife, no children, just a few longhorns, 2 dogs, and more quiet than any man needed. Beulah did not cry again. Not when she stepped into his house still wearing the torn wedding dress. Not when she scrubbed her arms raw at the basin. Not even that night when he offered her the bed and took the floor. "What town were you headed to?" he asked from his blanket. She stared at the ceiling. "He was from Amarillo. Supposed to marry me soon as we arrived. My family arranged it. They know what happened." "No," she said, "and there is no one left to care." Grady turned onto his side, watching her in the moonlight. "You got people somewhere." Beulah shook her head. "Mama died when I was 15. My sister married off east. Father passed last year. I was supposed to become someone else's problem." Her voice held no bitterness, just fact. "You are nobody's problem," Grady said. Beulah looked at him then. For the first time her eyes softened. 2 days passed. Then 3. Beulah shed the dress, wrapping herself in one of his spare shirts and a pair of work trousers she had to belt twice. She cooked, cleaned, and helped mend a fence that had been busted since spring. Grady watched her quietly. She never asked for help, never shied from work. She moved with a kind of stubborn grace, her mouth set in a line that said she had buried more than one thing and kept moving. "You gonna stay?" he asked one night over a pot of beans. She met his eyes across the table. "You want me gone?" "No," he said without thinking. "I want you safe." Beulah's fingers stilled on her spoon. "I do not know what to do now," she admitted. "I do not want to belong to someone just because I am unclaimed." "You ain't unclaimed, you are alive. That is enough." Her lips curved just barely. "You speak like a man who knows what it is to lose." "I do," he said. They did not speak more of it. On the 6th day, Grady returned from town with a letter in his hand and a boy trailing behind him. The boy looked to be around 7, with a mop of black hair and eyes sharp as nails. He held a rifle too big for him and glared at Beulah like she might vanish if he blinked. "This is Zeke," Grady said. "His mother died last year. His father worked the railroad, killed last week. Beulah knelt in front of the boy. "Hello, Zeke." Zeke said nothing. "He is staying here," Grady said. "If that is all right." Beulah nodded. "Of course." Zeke did not speak until bedtime, when he came to her in the kitchen, holding the hem of her borrowed shirt. "You the new one?" he asked. Beulah crouched. "What do you mean?" "The last woman who stayed here got sick and died. That was 2 years ago." Beulah blinked. "Well, I am not sick." The boy looked at her hard. "Can you shoot?" "Yes." "Can you ride?" "I am learning." Zeke nodded. "Good." Then he walked away. A week passed. Then another. Beulah taught Zeke how to make biscuits, how to boil water for shaving, how to sew a rip in a shirt. In return, Zeke taught her how to string a rabbit trap and how to whistle with his fingers. Grady watched it all with quiet eyes. One evening he found Beulah barefoot in the pasture, watching the sun go down. He joined her, arms folded, hat low over his brow. "You do not talk much," she said after a while. "I do not need to." Beulah looked up at him. "Why did you take me in?" Grady took a slow breath. "Because no one else did. Because you looked me in the eye like you were not afraid to live." She stared at him, the wind pulling strands of hair around her face. Then she touched his hand. It was a small thing, light as a feather, but Grady felt it down to his bones. "I have been alone a long time," she said. "So have I." They stood there until the stars came out. That night Beulah did not sleep in the bed alone. She stood in the doorway watching him on the floor. "Grady," she said. He looked up. "I am not afraid of you." He rose slowly, and when he reached her, she touched his chest with both hands. "I want to stay," she whispered. "Then stay." He kissed her soft at first, like he did not want to scare her, but she pulled him closer and the kiss deepened, warm and sure. They made love slow and careful, not out of lust, but something deeper, something earned. After, with her head on his chest, Beulah whispered, "You rescued me." Grady stroked her hair. "You rescued yourself. I just got you out of the dirt." She smiled against his skin. "Still, I never thought I would feel safe again." "You are safe now, with me." And she believed him. By late July, the prairie had turned brittle under the sun, and the earth cracked in long, dry veins. Beulah stood near the chicken coop, sleeves rolled to her elbows, coaxing a broody hen off her nest with the kind of patience that came from somewhere deep and quiet. The hem of her skirt was stained from morning chores, and her hair was pinned in a rough twist that kept slipping loose. Grady watched her from the corral, one hand resting on the fence rail, the other brushing sawdust from his shirt. He'd spent the morning rebuilding the north gate after a bull had forced it open. Beulah had packed him bread and a jar of preserved peaches without being asked. Zeke, perched on the fence a few yards away, squinted at Grady. "She gonna stay forever?" Grady didn't look away from her. "That's up to her. She don't cry, ain't that strange? Not everyone cries out loud." Zeke swung his legs. "She's better than the school teacher. That one always smelled like chalk and vinegar." Grady gave a quiet grunt, then turned to the boy. "You finish your reading." Zeke slid down from the fence. "I like numbers better." "Well, numbers won't teach you how to read a contract." Beulah approached, wiping her palms on her apron as she reached them. "The red hen's not ready to give up her chicks. I left her be." Grady nodded. "That was wise." Zeke looked between them, then muttered, "I'll go check the traps." As he trotted off with his slingshot tucked in his waistband, Beulah leaned against the post beside Grady, eyes on the sloping pasture. "I dreamed last night," she said after a pause. Grady shifted slightly toward her. "What of, my mother?" She was hanging laundry, humming something I haven't heard since I was small. I could smell soap and sun on the sheets. He didn't speak, just waited. Beulah's voice was steady. She looked up at me and said, clear as day, "You're not lost anymore." She turned her face toward him. I think I believe her. Grady reached for her hand, calloused fingers brushing hers. "You're not." The breeze picked up, carrying the scent of dry grass and cooling iron from the forge. Beulah glanced at the barn door, left ajar. "You ever think about building on?" Grady raised a brow. "To the house. Zeke's getting older, he'll need space, and if there's ever another mouth to feed." His breath caught. Beulah didn't flinch. Grady cleared his throat, voice lower than before. "You thinking of staying long enough for that?" "I'm thinking of staying longer than that," she said. Later that week, Grady rode out south with a wagon and brought back lumber, hinges, and a second-hand cradle wrapped in burlap. Beulah didn't comment, just helped unload, her fingers lingering on the worn maple of the cradle rail. That night, she combed Zeke's hair by lamplight while Grady added a wall frame to the east side of the house. One afternoon, while Zeke fished down by the river fork, Beulah joined Grady in the new room, her hands full of nails and a quiet sort of happiness. "You ever build a home before?" she asked. He drove a nail into the beam. "Not like this." She handed him another. "I never had one that didn't feel borrowed." He looked at her then, sweat glistening along his brow, sawdust clinging to his shirt. "You've got one now." Something passed between them, wordless, certain. That night, as the wind picked up and the sky turned silver with stars, Grady found her outside, sitting on the porch swing he'd rigged from a wagon bench. She didn't turn when he sat beside her, just let her shoulder rest against his. "Tell me something you've never told anyone," she said. He was quiet a long time. "I used to hum when I was scared. In the war. Just low, under my breath, kept me from going hollow inside." Beulah reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "I used to braid my sister's hair while she read me books. She'd get impatient with the knots, but she let me do it anyway." They sat like that until the moon rose high, until the wind calmed and the porch creaked beneath them like the boards were sighing. Inside, Zeke slept curled beneath a quilt Beulah had mended. The house smelled of cornbread and cedar. Grady turned toward her, his voice rough but sure. "I don't want you ever wondering if you're wanted." "I don't," she said. "Not anymore." He kissed her then, not with caution but with promise, the kind that settled into bone and stayed there. And when she leaned into him, arms around his neck, they both knew they had already built something stronger than walls. It wasn't rescue that had saved them. It was what came after. By mid-August, the rains came. Not in torrents, but in slow, steady hours that soaked the earth and made the roof pop and settle as if the house were breathing. The wind pushed in through the cracks, bringing the scent of wet mesquite and sodden earth. Beulah stood at the hearth, stirring a pot of stew that smelled of smoked venison and onion greens, while Grady checked the window frames for leaks. Zeke sat cross-legged near the fire, carving notches into a stick with a dull blade Grady had blunted for him. His voice broke the quiet. "You ever been to Denver?" Beulah glanced over her shoulder. "No, you have. My ma used to talk about it, said the mountains looked like God's knuckles." Grady straightened from the window. She wasn't wrong. Zeke looked up, chin resting on his knees. "You think we could go there someday?" The question hung in the room for a long moment. Grady moved to the table and sat, rubbing his hands together. "Maybe, when we've got the means, and the horses to take us up that far." Beulah ladled stew into a bowl and brought it to the table. "We'd need coats, too, real ones, not just patched wool." Zeke nodded seriously, then returned to his carving. Later that evening, while the boy slept, Grady opened the trunk at the foot of the bed and pulled out a folded length of pale blue fabric. He held it out to Beulah. "Found this in a trader's chest in town. Thought you might know what to do with it." She unfolded it with careful fingers. The cotton was soft and finely woven, the kind used for Sunday dresses back east. She ran her hand over the cloth, then looked up at him. "I could make something with sleeves," she said, "and a proper hem. I figured you might want something that's yours." She sat beside him, the fabric draped over her lap. "You're the first man who's ever given me something without expecting anything back." "I don't expect anything," he said. Beulah traced the edge of the cloth. "I know. That's what makes it mean something." They sat without speaking for a while, the firelight flickering low on the walls. Later, as the rain slowed to a hush and the wind settled, she reached for his hand. "I don't want to keep waiting on a life. I want to live one." Grady's voice was quiet. "With me, with you," she said. "If you'll have me." He kissed her, then not out of surprise but certainty. The kind that comes after days and nights of shared work, quiet understanding, and the slow, steady build of trust. In the morning, Beulah stood outside with a needle tucked behind her ear, measuring the fabric against the frame of the door to cut a straight line. Grady was splitting wood nearby, sleeves rolled, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt. Zeke came up the path with a rabbit in his hand, still warm from the snare. "Caught this near the fence line," Grady nodded. "That's good work." Beulah took the rabbit with a practiced grip. "You want to learn how to dress it?" Zeke hesitated. "You know how?" She looked him in the eye. "I've known how since I was younger than you." He followed her to the shed without another word. Inside, she showed him where to cut, how to peel the skin clean. Her voice was calm and her hands steady. Zeke watched her with narrowed eyes, trying to match her movements. Grady stepped into the doorway, arms folded, watching them work. Zeke didn't look up. "She's better at this than you." Grady's mouth tugged at the corner. "I know." When the sun broke through the clouds that afternoon, Grady hitched up the wagon and took them into Canyon. The town was still muddy from the storm, but folks were out dusting off stoops, hammering loose shingles, repairing what had blown loose. At the general store, Beulah picked out buttons for her new dress, deep brown ones that reminded her of river stones. Grady bought a small tin of sweets and slipped it into Zeke's hand without a word. Back at the ranch, Beulah stood in the doorway of the new room, measuring the wall for a shelf. Grady leaned beside her. "You think we'll fill this place up?" he asked. She looked around. "I think we already have." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I want to marry you, Beulah, not because you need it, but because I do." She turned to face him, arms crossed, eyes steady. "You sure?" "I've never been more." Her nod came slow but sure. "Then let's do it proper, quiet. Just us and the boy." They married under a cottonwood near the north pasture, with only the wind and the cattle for witness. Zeke stood beside them, holding a sprig of sage he'd picked himself. Afterward, they shared cornbread and beans at the table, and Grady carved their initials into the porch rail with his pocket knife. That night, Grady lay in bed with Beulah's head resting on his shoulder, her hand warm in his. "You still hum when you're scared?" she asked. "Not anymore." She smiled against his skin. "Me neither." And outside, the prairie stretched wide and open, quiet with the kind of peace that only comes when the storm has passed and everything left standing belongs. September brought cooler winds, and with them, the first signs of the cottonwoods turning pale along the edges. Grady rode out early that morning, leaving Beulah and Zeke with the list of chores he'd scrawled in pencil on the back of an old ledger page. The boy had taken to the rhythm of ranch life more quickly than either of them expected, though he still muttered under his breath when it came to sweeping the stalls. Beulah knelt by the garden bed near the porch, pulling the last of the summer beans. The soil clung damp and dark to her fingers. She'd planted late after the storm, but it had grown well enough. She paused when she spotted a sprig of wild mint pushing up between the rows, its scent sharp in the morning air. Zeke wandered up carrying an empty pail and his slingshot tucked inside his shirt. "You gonna keep that?" he asked, pointing with his chin toward the mint. She brushed her hair back with the back of her wrist. "Might dry it for tea. You drink tea when you're sick. I drink it when I'm not." Zeke crouched beside her, picking at the dirt with a stick. "You ever ride a train?" She looked at him sideways. "No," he nodded, satisfied. "I saw one once, thought it looked like something from a dream." She smiled faintly. "Dreams can be loud and fast too, I guess." He sat back on his heels. "Grady says I'll be tall." "Think that's true?" "Only way to find out is keep growing." The boy grinned, then stood and wandered off, pail swinging. Inside, Beulah washed the dirt from her hands and sorted the beans into a crock. The house had taken on a lived-in stillness that made it feel more like a place people belonged than just somewhere they ended up. The new room stood finished, with shelves now holding folded quilts and a box of books Grady had brought from a neighbor heading south. By the time the sun moved past the midday peak, Grady returned with a sack of oats slung over his shoulder and a look that told her something had happened. Beulah met him on the porch. "What is it?" "There's a family moving through," he said, setting the sack down. "Wagon broke an axle 3 miles out. Got 2 girls, both under 10, and the mother's near due." She wiped her palms down her apron. "They headed west," he nodded, "toward the Pecos, looking for work with a sheep outfit." She looked toward the barn. "We've got space in the loft." "It'd be dry." "They'll need more than dry," he said. Beulah didn't hesitate. "Then let's get the blankets aired." Grady watched her for a beat, then followed her into the house. By dusk, the family arrived on foot, Mr. and Mrs. Albright, with their daughters clinging to the back of their skirts. Beulah led them inside, offered water and a place to rest. The girls stared wide-eyed at Zeke, who stood stiff with his arms folded until Beulah nudged him forward. "You can show them where the hay's softest." He glanced at her, then nodded and beckoned the girls toward the barn. "Mrs." Albright lowered herself onto the bench near the hearth, one hand braced against her belly. "We didn't expect kindness out this way." Beulah met her eyes. "It's not rare as you think. Just quiet." Later that night, Grady stood near the fence line, lantern in hand, watching the stars blink steady in the black sky. Beulah joined him, shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. "You think they'll be all right?" she asked. "They've got each other." She leaned against the post beside him. "I still don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along that day." He looked at her, his voice low. "You would have gotten up. You always do." She turned her face toward him, eyes soft. "I've never wanted anything more than to be useful," she said. "You're more than that," he said. "You're what steadies the ground." The wind stirred the grass around them, and she reached for his hand. "I want to have a child," she said. He didn't answer right away, just laced his fingers through hers. "I do too," he said at last. "Only if you're ready." "I'm not afraid," he nodded, tightening his grip. Neither of them spoke again that night, but they stood there until the lantern burned low, and the last of the crickets fell quiet. In the weeks that followed, the Albrights moved on, the axle repaired with help from Grady's spare timber and Beulah's insistence they take a sack of flour and a jar of pickled eggs. The girls hugged Zeke goodbye, and he ducked his head, cheeks red. After they left, Beulah found him sitting on the porch rail chewing a blade of grass. "You miss them?" she asked. He shrugged. "They were loud, but nice." He glanced at her. "You gonna name the baby something funny?" She gave him a look. "Who said there was a baby?" He looked smug. "Grady walked out of the barn whistling yesterday." Beulah laughed, the sound surprising them both. "Well," she said, "I guess we'll have to think of something fitting then." Grady stepped out onto the porch behind them, wiping his hands on a rag. "You two talking secrets?" Zeke jumped down from the rail. "Just guessing names." Grady looked at Beulah, and in that look was every word they didn't say aloud. She stepped closer, resting her hand against his chest. "We'll build this life one piece at a time," she said. He leaned down, forehead against hers. "We already are." October settled over the land with a hush. The heat had drained from the days, and morning frost clung to the porch rails like a quiet warning. Beulah pulled on a shawl before stepping outside, the woven wool scratchy but warm against her arms. Grady was already in the pasture, leading the cattle down toward the lower slope, his breath rising in faint clouds as he called to them low and steady. Inside, Zeke crouched near the stove, feeding it small logs with practiced ease. He didn't speak until Beulah returned with the eggs, her breath still catching from the cold. "There's a fox out by the fence post," he said without looking up. "Watched me when I came back from the spring." She cracked 2 eggs into the skillet. "Did it look hungry?" Zeke shrugged. "Didn't look scared." She handed him a slice of toast. "Then we'll keep the chickens shut in until Grady gets the traps up again." Zeke took the bread, chewing quietly. Then, without raising his eyes, he said, "Is it hard?" "Having a baby," Beulah didn't answer right away. "It's work. Some of it hurts. But most of it is waiting." He nodded, then asked, "You think it'll be a girl?" "I think it'll be whatever it wants to be." Zeke finished the last of the bread and rose to fetch his coat. "I'll watch the coop." As he stepped outside, Beulah watched him through the window. He'd started growing into his limbs, and the way he moved had lost some of that nervous edge he'd carried when he first arrived. The boy was becoming someone solid. By noon, Grady returned, his gloves damp from checking the creek traps. He leaned against the doorframe, watching Beulah knead biscuit dough at the table. "You feel all right?" he asked. She didn't look up. "Tired, but steady." He stepped inside, took the pitcher from the counter, and poured a cup of water for her. "Town doctor's passing through next week. Heading toward Lubbock. I thought we might ask him to stop." She dusted flour from her wrists. "You think something's wrong?" "No, I just want to know everything's right." She took the cup from his hand and held his gaze for a long moment. "You've changed, Grady." "How so?" "You used to wait for things to go wrong. Now you plan for things to go right." He looked down, then back at her. "That's because I've got something worth keeping right." She didn't answer, just reached out and touched his chest, her palm resting over his heart. That evening, as the sun fell low and the sky turned the color of brass, Zeke came running back from the hilltop with his hair tousled and his cheeks flushed. "There's a wagon," he called, skidding to a stop by the porch. "Coming slow from the south. Looks like the doctor." Grady set down the pail he'd been carrying and nodded once. "I'll meet him at the road." By the time the wagon reached the gate, the sun had dipped low enough to cast long shadows across the dry grass. The doctor, a thin man with a voice like dry paper, climbed down stiffly and shook Grady's hand. Beulah waited on the porch, watching as the 2 men spoke quietly. After a minute, Grady turned and beckoned her forward. Inside, the doctor was efficient and calm. He asked questions, listened to her belly with a horn tube, made a few notes in a worn ledger, then looked up with a faint smile. "Strong heartbeat. Good position. You'll likely see the child before the frost sets in proper." Beulah glanced at Grady, who stood near the window. He didn't speak, but his jaw relaxed just slightly. The doctor packed up his things and accepted a jar of preserved plums as payment before continuing on. Once the wagon disappeared down the road, Beulah stepped back into the house and leaned against the door. "He said everything's fine." "I heard." Grady moved to her and rested a hand on her back, guiding her gently to the bench. She sat and he lowered himself beside her. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what comes after." Beulah looked at him, waiting. "I want to give you something," he said, reaching into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small leather pouch and placed it in her hand. Inside was a simple silver band, its surface etched with a line of prairie grass. Her fingers closed around it. "When did you have this made?" "Last week." "From the blacksmith down in Cholea. Thought you deserved more than a promise in words." She slipped it over her finger, turning it once to catch the light. "I never thought I'd wear something like this," she said softly. "You wear it well." They sat together until the last of the light faded from the windows, and the house settled into the hush that came after wood smoke and supper. The next morning, Beulah awoke before dawn. She moved slowly, careful not to wake Grady, and stepped outside into the chill. The stars were still scattered across the sky, and the grass crackled under her bare feet. She stood there for a long time, hand resting just below her ribs, the shape of a new life already shifting beneath her skin. Behind her, the door creaked open. "You all right?" Grady's voice was still rough with sleep. She turned, met his gaze. "I'm ready," she said. He crossed to her, wrapped his arms around her from behind, and rested his chin on her shoulder. "You always were," he said. They stood that way until the sun crested the horizon, warming the frost into dew. 3 weeks later, the baby came in the quiet of early morning, with Zeke waiting outside the room, knees drawn to his chest, and Grady holding Beulah's hand as she bore down against the pane with a strength he'd never seen in any battlefield or storm. When it was done and the child lay curled against her chest, Beulah looked at Grady and smiled. "It's a girl." He knelt beside her, brushing damp curls from her brow. "She's beautiful." Beulah looked down at the tiny face, eyes closed, mouth twitching in sleep. "She's ours," she said. Zeke crept in a little later, peering at the swaddled bundle. "She looks like she's thinking hard," he whispered. Grady ruffled his hair. "She's figuring us out." They named her Willa after Beulah's mother. In the months that followed, the days grew shorter, but the house grew fuller. Willa's cries filled the night, and Zeke learned to rock her soft and slow when Beulah's hands were busy. Grady built a rocking chair from scrap wood, sanding it smooth through long winter evenings. Beulah planted a row of lilacs behind the house when spring returned, their scent drifting through the open windows. One afternoon, Grady paused in the doorway and watched Beulah feeding Willa in the cradle of her arms, Zeke sitting at her feet whittling shapes from driftwood. He stepped out, walked to the porch, and looked across the land. The wind moved through the grass, steady and warm. The house behind him was quiet in the way only peace could be. He turned back inside, where everything he loved was waiting. And they went on living, not because life was easy, but because it was theirs, made with care and loss and fierce, enduring love together. Always.